I just want to start by saying a quick thank you actually to all of the students, especially I know there are so many key worker nurses out there who put themselves on the front line during this pandemic. So thank you, each and every one of you. I can't imagine how difficult the past few months must have been for you all. I'm going to give a talk generally sort of about HE, but I also sort of, I suppose, want to make this a point from the very beginning, and that since sort of taking on this role, and actually during my time on the Education Select Committee, I've always tried to be an advocate for part-time learning and for mature students, which is one of the many reasons why I value the Open University so much, because of the work that you do. Because I think because of changes to funding and changes to universities since 2014, they seem to be feeling more and more like places that are built for 18-year-olds who are full-time students who don't want to live at home anymore. And I think lifelong learning has to be what we talk about now. Instead of this artificial divide almost between higher education, further education, distance learning and home learning, we should instead be talking about lifelong learning. And this is why I see the Open University as something that people can go in and out of throughout their whole career. And indeed, you know, many of the courses on Open Learn are things I've directed some of my constituents to. Now, Labour Party committed to lifelong learning in the last manifesto, and it still is something we hold incredibly important. Now, COVID-19 has accelerated the change to our economy and the change to jobs, but these changes were already there before this even happened. The changes in automation, we could see this in the way that jobs were being adapted and changed, and this building need to upskill and reskill our population and everybody in it. We've been talking in the Labour Party about needing a jobs economy, a jobs budget, and put our little infographic out with all the jobs on, saying this is what we must focus on. We can also have an education-led economy. This could be a huge opportunity for our whole country to actually look at the jobs growth for the future and actually retrain and reskill people ready for it. And that can only happen if we increase the numbers of part-time learners and mature students going into the higher education system. Because what I've been saying is, if we start to look as a country at where are the areas for jobs growth going to be in the future, they're going to be around AI, they're going to be around green jobs in the green industrial revolution. And of course, key workers, we're going to need so many more. This government promised 50,000, I think it was, extra nurses. And yet this year, in the allocation that they've given our universities, they've only promised an extra 5,000 key worker students. And that's not just nurses alone. There's huge changes needed in that area as well. Because as we see with COVID, jobs that people traditionally relied on are going to be changed as well. We've also got changes to come from us leaving, we have left the European Union, from the end of the transition period of the European Union and from January. And that's going to have an impact on our economy, which will all depend on the imports and exports that we start developing as a country, and a huge impact, of course, on our farming industry. So how do we make life easier for part-time students? I mean, there are huge funding concerns I have around the whole way university education is funded. And without obviously talking about, definite Labour policy a number of years before the election and before we've written our manifesto, I have spoken about the need for an alternative funding regime for higher education, and the need for a proper support package for people out there, because universities cannot be solely for, as I've said before, 18-year-olds. And I've also said on a number of occasions, if we want to encourage mature students to go back into university, which is what we need, what our country needs, what our economy needs, and what individuals need, are we really going to ask them to take on 20,000 plus worth of debt for the privilege of doing so? Are we going to find that palatable as a country to say that to somebody who may be in their 40s or 50s and have caring responsibilities? You have to take on all this debt to access the learning and the qualifications that we as a country need. It doesn't feel the right way around to me. Although higher education has escaped the worst of austerity for the past 10 years, it's escaped that austerity on the backs of the students because of the way higher education is funded. So I think we need to be looking at that again and finding a new way to fund and develop our universities. Sorry, the children are coming in and out of the room, so apologies if I look a little distracted at times, keeping an eye on the door. So getting rid of these barriers to learning. I've spoken many times before about equality is not giving everyone the same thing and then asking why everyone hasn't succeeded equally. Equality is about looking at the barriers different people face and finding ways to address them. So I know, as you've just heard, I'm a mum. I've got 2 children, which are, always entertaining. If it's not the children, it's the cat that tends to interrupt my Zoom meeting. So, we have all these barriers to learning. We have all these barriers to getting on. So how can a university bring them down? Simple things we could look at doing, which is increasing the amount of childcare available, looking at maintenance loans. And this is something I've been supporting the Open University on before, which is the fact you can't access maintenance loans if you're a distance learner, but you can if you're going in university part-time. I mean, that's not equal, and that's not fair. As a part-time learner, you've still got your job to do and you've still got your learning to do. And you might be looking at reducing your hours at work to fit your learning in. You have that loss in income. We need to be looking at financial alternatives to support people in them. And again, the Open University have been leading the way on online learning for a very, very long time here. And I hope that experience has been passed on to many other universities as they look at developing a more blended approach, because the OU has been the vehicle for social mobility for so many people up and down the country, but it's been made a lot harder. For example, issues I've spoken about around digital poverty as well, which is around expecting that everybody has access to equipment at home, everyone has access to connectivity, and not taking into account the cost of these. So one of the small things I've been doing is working and supporting JISC and a number of other organisations in creating what we call a data-free list. So the principle behind this is every time you log on to certain websites, they use your data. Individual companies, mobile phone providers, broadband providers can switch off the data that's used for those sites. So give you an example, with O2, if you use all your data, you can still go on the O2 website to pop up. It's a data-free site for O2. And wouldn't it be good if we made educational sites all data-free, so that you could access any educational site that you need for your learning anywhere, and it wouldn't cost you anything in terms of your data? I mean, the use of data is so very, very small for some of these sites, but it would make such a difference to so many people learning around the country and just open up that equality. And that's what fundamentally I talk about: quality of opportunity, giving everybody the same opportunity to exceed by recognising people face different barriers and finding ways to address them. So I think on that point, I think that's about 10 minutes. I will stop, and I look forward to hearing your questions. Oh, so I should just mention, actually, before we go, something you might have picked up on last night and was in the news today, which is the government's proposed changes to post-qualification admissions, which is they're looking at changing the rules for university so that you get your qualifications before you actually go to university, rather than based on your predicted grades. So I'll be keen to hear people's thoughts on that and whether it would make a difference to where perhaps you would choose to study. But thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Emma. Some really interesting thoughts to think about there. I'm going to hand over now to Dan, who is our moderator, I think, who will be having some questions for you from the audience.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Emma, for a really insightful talk there. Yeah, we've had some questions coming in from students. First one, which you partly answered, was around the commitment to lifelong learning and the position on student finance and maintenance loans for part-time students. Although you kind of answered it, I'm interested to know how you would create a consensus around that. What are the additional arguments that you can make around the benefits to the economy and other sort of broader arguments that might build a consensus around support for maintenance loans for part-time students?
Thanks, Sam. I think we can see the difference already, because if you look at what the Welsh Labour government have done and how that's improved the numbers of part-time students, you can really see the difference that having that maintenance support actually gives. And I think sort of the evidence is there already for the government. We're going to have, it depress everybody on a Saturday morning, but we're going to be looking at one of the worst recessions potentially in 300 years. We have millions of people on a furlough scheme. And when that comes to an end, there are huge question marks over whether at the end of that they're going to be looking at redundancy or whether they're going to re-enter the jobs market. I mean, this is going to fundamentally change our economy, and the government need to think we can use education to not only deal with the here and now, the problems we're having around unemployment, but also to build stronger and build better for the future. I mean, the opportunity is right there and there's for the taking. The government needs to really think, and it comes down to, I suppose, not just a question of priorities, but also, I'd argue, common sense. Would you rather fund lots of people through unemployment benefit schemes because they're unable to access work and they've been made redundant? Or would you rather fund people through education by giving them the maintenance and support they need? They can go retrain and reskill and develop and take on a new career. And they're the arguments we need to be looking at. And I've been working quite closely with the MP, Labour MP, Seema Malhotra, who's in the Department for Work and Pensions team, to say we shouldn't be just looking at education on one hand and employment on the other, but education and employment as a package of coming together. Because, you know, I've said in my recent letter to the Higher Education Minister, we can't just rely on jobs coaches in job centres to be able to direct people towards the education opportunities that are available. It needs to be a joined up process. So I think the argument, almost COVID-19 is helping to make those arguments forward. The government could ignore the fall off in numbers of part-time students before, because universities were still getting the 18-year-olds, they were still getting all the funding they need. They can't ignore that anymore. They cannot ignore the ever-rising numbers of unemployed people out there. They can't ignore it. So we've got to look at a way of funding people and the way of giving people another opportunity.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, another question. What are your views on the idea of funding to be made available for mature students who want to do a second degree later on in life?
For getting rid of the equivalent learning qualification. Yeah, I mean, I kind of caused some controversy when I spoke, I think, last year, when I talked about whether or not, in terms of degree apprenticeships, you could limit the number of people doing a second degree. But I think COVID-19 has changed all of that. You've got to sort of look at the second degrees that people are going to be taking. If you did a degree sort of 15 years ago in a subject and for a career that's no longer there, and you're instead looking for a degree, for example, to go on and do nursing or to go and do teaching or social work, all these areas where we've got huge occupational shortages, are we really going to not allow people to do that? I mean, and obviously it all comes with a cost, and so I'm wary of, as I say, committing to anything this long away from a general election, but it's something we should be seriously looking at, and the government should be seriously looking at it as well. And indeed, the Universities UK pulled together a proposal, and they instead talked around fee forgiveness of key workers and how we could increase the number of key workers out there. Because we've still got here in Hull, as I'm sitting here from Hull, we've got in our hospital right now loads of nursing vacancies. We're desperate for jobs. Anyone who trains as a nurse in Hull is guaranteed a job, in Hull as a nurse, because there's no, we're always fighting for students and nurses to come over here. And this is the same in many, many areas across the country. So are we really going to say, at the time when, as I say, we're leaving the European Union, or we've left the European Union already, are we really going to say that we're not going to give people that chance to retrain and reskill and become qualified in a certain area, which our country needs us to do, just because of this rule around equivalent learning qualifications? So, I think I'm hoping it's an argument that doesn't really need making to the government, because I think the economy will make them think again about it.
That's great, and we're getting quite a few questions on the funding of higher education generally. I think people sort of generally want to know your views on the sort of marketisation of higher education, how you think higher education should be funded. I know you can't sort of predict what the manifesto is going to be in 3 or 4 years' time, but your views generally on student finance, whether that should come from government, tuition fees, etc., those kinds of issues.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we do need to have a much wider conversation about the future of funding for all of higher education, and that's something I've spoken before when I was talking to the Universities Alliance about, and through the Labour Party, I want to have that bigger conversation with members, with the NUS, with obviously your students as well, to say, well, what's an alternative model look like? Because the model that we've got and the marketisation system, I think, is driving the wrong behaviours. If you take unconditional offers as an example, you cannot on one hand criticise universities for offering unconditional offers, but at the same time knowing that they're wholly reliant on the number of students through the door for their funding. It's going to drive these behaviours. And also I've been really concerned about loss of capacity in different kinds of courses, because if you've got a course and there's only a few students, and there's one example I'll give you, which is on maritime studies, which is kind of niche, but it's something as a country we've always done, and we're world renowned for it. But it's paid for pretty much because of international students that come in, because there isn't a huge domestic demand for specialised maritime studies. Those international students that come, that course will close because of the whole way the market works. You can't sustain a course if you don't have the right numbers, even though it's something that we as a country are world renowned to do. So I think if you weren't basing every decision just on the market, you were basing the decision on what our country needs, you might make different decisions.
Okay, I'm a student with a toddler. However, because I'm studying with the OU, I'm not able to access the funding for my 2-year-old to go to nursery 2 days a week. But my sister, who is not at work and not studying, can get the funding. Is this something Labour would look to address?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, it goes back to what I said before. It's reducing those barriers and equality of opportunity and giving everyone that equal chance. I mean, I think I mentioned earlier on that the fact that you can't get maintenance loans because it's seen as remote learning rather than physical learning, and not taking into account that you'll still be facing additional costs with the Open University. I mean, I've spoken to the Open University a few times, and we were looking at various ways to raise this, actually before I took on this brief when I was on the Education Select Committee. So absolutely, and best of luck to her, because it's incredibly difficult doing anything with a toddler around. So it must be incredibly difficult to keep studying through this time. So yeah, I mean, that's a tough ask. I mean, certainly when mine were little like that, it was enough, I think, getting up and getting dressed in the morning. But but yeah, no, absolutely, we should be looking at making it fair and equal for everybody. And I'm quite, yeah, that's not what we'd want to continue.
So here's an interesting one. Do you think a 4-day working week could help give people more space to study part-time?
Yeah, I mean, that was, as you know, in the last Labour manifesto, and there are people looking at it now as a way of dealing with what's happening with the economy. So it's definitely, I think it's always going to be an option. But I prefer to talk about, instead of right to learn. I'm really keen to explore the idea around people having a statutory right to time off to do studying and learning. Because if we're really committed to lifelong learning, and again, if we're looking at removing some of the barriers, then one of the biggest barriers is time. People simply, when they've got families and they've got work, don't have the time. But if we had a statutory right to learn that gave people that time off that potentially workplaces had to comply with, then I think that could be one way around it, of giving people that little bit more time and giving people that access. And in fact, before COVID-19, we were looking at the employment bill that the government were going to bring forward, and whether or not we could offer amendments to that bill to offer this right to learn. I was starting to have conversations with various business organisations and higher education, further education, around what it would look like. And I'd be quite keen to sort of continue those conversations again going forward, because lifelong learning is going to be more important than ever was before. We've already seen this historical idea around people starting one job and staying in it throughout their whole career is just gone. I mean, I've worked as a nursery nurse, I've worked in a bank, I've become a teacher, I then worked for a trade union, I've now become a member of parliament. And most people have a number of careers throughout their life. So this need to continually retrain and upskill and move in careers into a different way You need education to be there all the time. So if we accept that as a country, we know that's going to happen. We need it for our economy, with automation coming and changing the whole way work is going to look like, and also the need for sort of green energy and green jobs moving into the future. So we know that. So how can we convince people to do it, retrain and reskill, because our country needs it, our economy needs it? And as I say, one of these ways of looking at it is giving people time, giving them that right to learn, giving them that statutory time to be able to study and to be able to develop skills for a new career and a new job. But that's kind of where my thinking is at the moment on that.
Okay, if we could just do a couple more, then I had a couple of questions about some of the, so we've got worldwide protests against injustices suffered by Black community at the moment. What do universities on these shores need to do to address systemic imbalances in opportunity and attainment in higher education by Black and Asian, minority ethnic students, and sort of how might students contribute to sort of improving these issues in wider society?
Yeah, really, really important question. But I think before even that, we've got to look at, as I say, access to university from the very beginning. And one of the things I mentioned right at the very start was this idea around post qualification admissions, because the statistical truth is that when students from disadvantaged and BME backgrounds are teacher assessed, they're often assessed at having lower grades to the ones they actually obtain. So the current system we have of access to universities, which are based on predicted grades, is discriminating against students from BME backgrounds and from disadvantaged backgrounds, which is why, I realise it's difficult, I know it's going to be hard, but why I'm championing post-qualification admissions, because it just removes one of the disadvantages faced by the BME community. But then we have the problem then when we get to universities and the awarding gap between BAME students and students from disadvantaged backgrounds and students that don't have those, because that's it is appalling. But yet still, when we're looking at the way we judge universities and the marks that we children coming in and out all the time, and the marks that we give university and how we rate them, we don't actually include in that data looking at the attainment gap for BAME students. So we have this situation where university can be regarded as a gold standard university, but still have a huge attainment gap for BAME students. So if we actually look at the way that we look at universities from the very start, and what emphasis we put on some of these, if we put a greater emphasis on the fact that we have this awarding gap for BAME students, that might drive change in the universities. The universities need to take ownership of this as well. And it's down to each and every one of us. And sometimes it's quite easy, and in our position, yes, to put the responsibility on the shoulders of the government, but it's all of our responsibility. We've all, this situation hasn't just been created by the government, although, argue how successful they've dealt with it. But this is a situation that's been around for a very, very long time. So we need to, so individual institutions, individual student unions need to be looking at this and actively doing something about it, because if we're all waiting for somebody else to solve the problem, change is never going to happen.
That's brilliant. And if I could just get one more quick one in before you have to go. How can OU students most effectively influence policymaking and politicians in Westminster to ensure that the voices and experiences of part-time students really contribute to that debate about, the needs of those students going forward?
That's a great question. And there are so many things that students can do. I mean, obviously, the great thing about the Open University is because it's geographically diverse. You've got so many different members of Parliament that can be lobbied and talked to about the needs for OU students and the needs for part-time students. So there are people right around the country that you can all lobby on this. There's also all-party parliamentary groups. My colleague Paul Blomfield's very involved in the student APPG and a really strong advocate for the sector. And then there's also the all-party parliamentary group for universities as well. Now, as individual students all around the country, you can contact your member of parliament, ask them to attend that meeting and speak on your behalf, and then ask them what happened afterwards. And I think you have that power as individual constituents to actually request something specific and concrete from your Member of Parliament. Now, of course, things happen and there are debates and votes and not everyone can always attend, but that Member of Parliament is still mandated by yourself to go and actually take your concerns to the powers that be. So there's one way in which you can do that. And of course, you know, I'm always happy to sort of come back and engage with you as a student body, because I think the needs of the Open University students are sometimes a bit different. So as I say, you're 18-year-old full-time student, but we need more people like yourselves. We need more mature part-time students. As I say, our economy needs this, individuals need this. Our future prosperity will be built on what happens right now in terms of retraining and having that education-led recovery. So you're crucially important and we need more of you. And the government, and I will do my best to keep pointing that out to the government as well, so we can learn from your experiences. And like the woman who spoke about the toddler and the 2-year-old and the nursery places, these are the concrete bits of feedback that we need, these specifics that might not have occurred to policymakers before, so they can actually look at them and address them and do something about it. So having these concrete examples, and because sometimes with policy, there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all policy that's going to cure everybody's problems immediately. But these small changes, like giving the woman who spoke, so the toddler, the childcare for her 2-year-old, will make a huge difference to whether or not she's able to continue her studies and succeed. And that will be replicated throughout the country. So please do keep in touch. Keep raising these individual issues with me so then I can take them directly to government. Keep lobbying your members of parliament and working together as a collective body, because you are unique, and what you're saying and what we can learn from your experiences, I think will genuinely have a big impact on how quickly our country recovers from the impacts of COVID-19.